Welcome to the Good Shepherd and the Child podcast, where we explore the spirituality of the Christian child through the method of the catechesis of the Good Shepherd. I'm your host, Carrie Mecki Lozano. Welcome to season 5 of the podcast. I cannot believe we are already in our 5th year, and we will be starting off this season with a series on freedom and responsibility, or freedom and independence and discipline, which will be based off of Jana's chapter 12 of her book, Nurturing the Whole Child. Now, this is a huge topic. I'm excited that we're going to have multiple episodes on it. We actually talked about it a few years ago. Claire Paglia joined us on the podcast, and so I'll put a link in our show notes if you want to listen to that episode also. But this is a topic that all of us desire to grow in. And so I'm happy to do a series to really learn more about it. So we have Sister Maria Teresita Rodkey that is joining me on the podcast. She is a Dominican Sister of St. Cecilia. She currently serves as an upper elementary Montessori guide at St. Philip Learning Center, which is a Catholic Montessori homeschooling enrichment program in Tennessee. She's also a catechist for level 2 and 3 in a parish. She's a formation leader for level 1 and 2. And she holds an AMI diploma in elementary. So we are really excited to have her on the podcast to jumpstart this 3-part series on freedom and responsibility. I hope you enjoy. Sister Maria Teresita, welcome to the Good Shepherd and the Child podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so good to be here.
I'm really excited to have this conversation with you, to get to know you better and just kind of sit at your feet. I think this conversation that we're going to have, this topic that we are talking about today and for the next couple episodes, is a topic that a lot of catechists desire to hear more about. Not actually just catechists, parents, Montessorians. Freedom and discipline, freedom and responsibility is one of those topics that everybody, when they leave formation and they work with children, or they go home after formation and work with their own children, just spend time with their own children, we go, okay, wait, this isn't looking like I thought it was supposed to look.
Right.
And so then it's very discouraging. And I think that this topic of freedom and responsibility, freedom and discipline, however the words that you want to use, multiple are used for this. I think that this is the answer to that distinction between what you experience in formation with all adults and then when you apply it actually to children. Yes. So I'm excited to sit at your feet and really dive into this topic because I think it is really important.
Oh, thank you, Carrie. And really, we're really sitting at the feet of Maria Montessori and Sophia Cavalletti and Gianna Gobi. So
yes.
So I have nothing original to share, just things that I have heard from them. And I love how you started too, because I remember the first time that I opened up Maria Montessori's writings, going through my Montessori training, and I remember reading on one page, and she said with great emphasis, the children must be given absolute freedom. And then I turned the page and she said, what are you doing? You can't let the children do whatever they want. And so I remember thinking, whoa, what does she really want here? And I think one of the important things that I learned from those great Montessorians that have gone before us is that we really never speak about freedom without also speaking about responsibility. So the two actually go together. They are two sides of the same coin. So, for example, you can't have responsibility without freedom. If I ask you to wash the dishes, well, you can't do that unless I let you touch the dishes. So you really can't have responsibility without having freedom. But the opposite is also true, and maybe a little bit harder to wrap our heads around, that we cannot have freedom without also having responsibility. I think a lot of times in our current world, we tend to think that we might be able to have freedom without responsibility. What tends to happen is that people become very unhappy when they have been given liberty without responsibility, or have not been helped to see the fact that their actions have an effect on the whole of humanity. It's a mysterious concept that Maria Montessori liked to call the theory of interdependencies, the fact that we are created as social beings and everything that we do has an effect on the whole. And that's where our responsibility is so important to become aware of that. And so what we end up with if we have freedom without responsibility is we end up really with flailing wills, volitional flailing. And oftentimes people think, if I only had more freedom, if people just let me do this or they let me do that, when in reality, their unhappiness comes from not a lack of freedom, but a lack of responsibility. And this kind of brings us to the point of, well, how does a person achieve this? This is really a balance that the person achieves. And I really think that it's synonymous with the normalization that Maria Montessori spoke about as the goal of her work with people. And normalization, if you really take it to its fullest, is holiness. It's being whole. It's being integrated. It's having your mind and your will and your body all working in unison towards a goal, an end. So really, this is a work of a lifetime. This does not happen the first day of atrium. And so as Montessorians, we speak about the fact that freedom and responsibility grow as the child grows. So very clearly, an infant has less freedom and less responsibility than a 10-year-old does, simply because of their place in development, their stage of development. So the will develops as the person develops, and this also requires that the person be given the opportunity to exercise their will. And we know that the will is that power that gives us the ability to choose. And the will wants to choose what is good. That's what the will is directed to. But it needs the mind to show it what is the true and the good. And this is where there's another important piece here, that freedom really depends on knowledge. You have to have knowledge in order to be free. So, for example, if all of the lights suddenly went out, I and you might know, the only thing we know is that when we flip the little switch, that the lights come back on. But if that doesn't work, something more is wrong that's beyond our knowledge, we're not really free in that situation to make the lights come on. If somebody who is an electrician walks in, they have more knowledge because they know how the room is wired, and so they can discern where an adjustment needs to be made, and they have the ability to make that adjustment. And so they are actually more free because they have more knowledge. So this is another one of those delicate balances in the atrium. And usually it comes down to, when do I present to a child and when do I let them work? That's another area that we discern constantly in our practice in the atrium with the children, because we know that in order for them to continue to grow in their relationship with the Lord, they also need to continually be given those little bits of knowledge that will help them along the way. But back to the development of the will, I think this really leads into our role as the adults. How do we provide an environment in which the child's will can be developed? And a point that I think is important, and I always bring up in my courses, is that right now we are living in a time when there hasn't been a really good balance between freedom and discipline, or freedom and responsibility in our culture, probably for maybe even 100 years. There's been large pendulum swings between a very authoritarian approach and a very permissive approach. And people tend to interact with children, whether as parents or teachers or catechists in response to how they were parented. So if somebody had a very, very authoritarian kind of experience growing up, they may pendulum swing to being permissive. Or if somebody had a permissive experience growing up, they tend to pendulum swing back to authoritarian. And so this is where Maria Montessori always says that the work of the adult is, first of all, our own preparation, our own personal preparation, and being able to discern within ourselves, what is my tendency? Which of the extremes do I tend towards? And then work on the opposite. So to find that balance in which children can find somebody who can really be an aid to their freedom and aid to the growth of their intellect and will.
That's huge. I think that
Yeah.
I think a lot of parents can identify with what you just said,
Yes.
whether it is triggered from our past, from the way we were parented, or just any other insecurity that we have that
Yes.
triggers the way that we parent or the way that we just interact with children. But I love what you said of identifying the virtue, whether it's freedom or responsibility that you tend to be good at or maybe heavy on, and lean into the opposite virtue. So I would agree, I think that my generation of parents tends to lean a lot more on the freedom side. It's, the follow the child, but almost to an extreme, the follow the child, but without the responsibility, without the limits, without the parameters set. So then the child lacks all responsibility and all discipline, self-discipline within them.
Yeah.
And so to pendulum swing, to check that in myself, to grow. And so how do I apply freedom but with discipline? Or how do I apply discipline but with freedom? So I love that you called that out. I think that that's really beautiful. And even as catechists, I think that we can identify which of those two we tend to be strong in, and ask God to help us grow in the opposite virtue. Because like you said at the very beginning, you cannot have one without the other and do this properly.
Yes. And another thing I think is important to keep in mind is that this is admittedly very difficult. It's admittedly very difficult. And I'm not sure that any one of us can say that we always get it perfectly right. Even Sophia and Gianna, I think if we were able to sit with them and say, do you always have a perfect balance between freedom and responsibility in your atrium? They might actually laugh at that. So I think it's another good opportunity for us to just realize in humility that this is something that we are always working toward, and not to be too hard on ourselves when things don't go right. We simply have to, take time at the end of the atrium session and say, what went well, what didn't go well, what might I do differently. I think that's a very reasonable kind of approach to our trying to achieve this kind of environment for the child. It's also really good to know that children are very forgiving. So if they know that you're really trying your best to respect them and to prepare an environment for them, they're very forgiving, and that's helpful too. And the only other thing that I wanted to mention is just that when this balance is hit, and there are moments, joyful moments, when we look around our atrium and everybody is peacefully working and they're working on things that are aiding the development of their relationship with the Lord, and what we experience in that moment is peace. And so peace is always a good indicator of how things are going with the freedom and responsibility. And so that's a great indicator for us to look for is there peace in this environment? If not, perhaps a little adjustment needs to be made one way or another. And that's something that, between your atrium sessions, you can discern and ask the Lord's guidance for what might need to be adjusted and where. And we just genuinely and honestly go about continuing to try to prepare that environment for the children and whatever that might be.
Yeah. I love that. I love that you gave us a tangible thing to look for, peace.
Yeah.
To show that the seesaw has been balanced. And when there's the lack thereof, I think the first response for us, both in our homes, in the atria, and just our interactions with children, our first reaction needs to check ourselves. Like Jana talks about at the beginning of the atrium, you should have an examination of conscience. But then what we're also kind of talking about is after your encounter with children to have another examination where you check yourself within that balance of freedom and discipline.
Right.
But I think our culture has kind of taught us to place the blame within the child. This child doesn't behave. This child doesn't respect authority, or whatever label that we have put on them.
Right.
But I think it starts, we first need to check ourselves because they are in a response to us. So when we can master this freedom and responsibility, if we can I shouldn't say master it because I don't think we ever do, but if we can really work on this balance of freedom and responsibility within the environment that we're creating, wherever that is, the children have a natural response to that. And Jana talks about that in her chapter in Nurturing the Whole Child, that they have this spontaneous self-discipline.
Yes.
That will come out when the environment is set properly. I don't mean the physically set. I mean the freedom and responsibility, the ways of the atrium, the manners that have been explained properly and taught. And when that environment is set in that way, the children have a natural, spontaneous self-discipline.
Yes.
And that peace that you're talking about flows naturally from that. That's the fruit that we see from that.
Right.
And so when there's a lack of peace, either within the child or within the community, we have to first go back and look at ourselves.
Right. And this is really rooted in our Judeo-Christian understanding of the human person, that we are created good, that we do want to do what is right and what is good. Sometimes we need a little help discerning what is good and what is right. But given that we know what is right and what is good, it is natural to the human person to do that. Yeah. I just wanted to even point out in Gianna Gobi's book, Nurturing the Whole Child, it's page 80 at the top. She says, moreover, we could say that the real value of freedom lies in the fact that it is a conquest involving a response to and claim of what is good and right. So there is rooted what we mean when we speak about responsibility. Literally, the word means able to respond. The human person, by nature, responds to the true and the good when they are given the ability to know it and to choose it. So, yeah, this is the beauty of our understanding as Christians of the human person. And it's such a much more wonderful understanding of the human person than to constantly have to keep people from doing bad.
Right. Or the more secular definition of discipline, that is different than when we talk about freedom and discipline within the Montessori philosophy.
Right.
The secular is like, go sit in time out. You didn't do what I said. Versus this, what Montessori is talking about, and correct me if I'm wrong, is more of like a self-discipline, or the limits that are put in within the freedoms that automatically create the discipline within myself to follow that.
Right. Where there is real freedom, it will create discipline within, because of the nature of the human person, directed towards the true and the good. So that fact, when the person has that and they have knowledge of what is true and what is good, they're naturally going to go for it. I experienced a wonderful example of this yesterday. Upper elementary Montessori children, I take them for walks when it gets cold. But I had one of the oldest boys leading the walk. And at first, I was like, I don't know if he will get us back on time, because we had the music director coming to sing with them. And I thought, I don't know if they'll get back there on time. And sure enough, here is a child who's grown up in a Montessori setting, and he has this balance of freedom and responsibility. And so halfway through the walk, he said to me, now, sister, If we need to turn back early, we can take this shortcut over here. And I was like, gosh, see, he really didn't need me in that situation to tell him what to do, when to turn back, because he already had that integrated understanding of, I am free to lead this walk. I get to decide which direction we go, but I also need to be responsible to make sure that people get back on time.
I love that. I love that because I see the seeds from level 1 in, like in level 1, how we are taught as the adult, as the child spills or is about to spill, your adult instinct is to jump in and correct them, right?
Right.
But in Montessori and in CGS, we are taught to sit on our hands and not intervene unless it's necessary. Any unnecessary intervention is an hindrance to development. And so I see that child that you're talking about, all the way back in his first plane, was allowed to make mistakes, was not constantly reminded, remember we have the music teacher coming, or remember to walk slowly so you don't spill the water. So they were allowed to critically think. They were allowed to have that freedom to make the mistakes and to then have the responsibility to fix their mistakes. And so now you have this older child who is aware of their surroundings because they grew up needing to be.
Yes.
Rather than, I think, our culture, out of all the love in our heart, we hover and we overhelp. Yes. So the child is never taught or never practiced or never exercised the need to think beyond themselves because they always have someone there doing it for them.
Right.
So I see in this child that you experienced yesterday, a child that was very aware of their surroundings, very aware of the needs of the schedule and the other people that are involved in the decision of where he's taking his class on a walk and how long that's going to take.
Exactly.
So that he can make decisions based on the good of the community, that interdependence that you were talking about, because from a very young age, he was allowed to do that and make mistakes and not be overly corrected.
Exactly.
I love that. And this whole concept of freedom and responsibility is so, when you see it and when Montessori talks about all the fruits that come with it, I just feel like that it's the answer to the world, right? You just wish that every kid could go into a Montessori school or an atrium and really experience this, to develop this within themselves. You want to teach parents this so that in their homes they can, give their child the freedom, but also don't forget to have the limits,
right?
Don't forget to have the responsibility that comes with that.
Right.
Allow your child to get themselves some water.
Right.
But if they spill the water, they have the responsibility to clean it up, or they only drink the water in the kitchen. They don't have the freedom to do whatever they want. There was a listener question that we had. Oh God, I want to say somewhere in the past year. And it was a level 1 catechist, and she was experiencing a lot of chaos. And Rebecca Voigt-Savage answered it. And I think that the question was something along the lines of, is it normal to have chaos the first so many weeks? And she said, never. There should never. She was so strong in her answer. There should never be chaos.
Right.
There should never be chaos. And I think that this is one of those myths around Montessori that so many people have, is they think that kids just have a free-for-all.
Right.
Because they hear this freedom that we embrace so much. The child gets to choose their work. Well, yes, they do, but within the limits that we provide for them. So there's not chaos. There should never be chaos, because you have to provide limits. You have to provide responsibility, or else, like you said, the child is not peaceful,
right?
Having full freedom.
Right. Exactly.
Nobody is. The whole community isn't. The whole family isn't.
Exactly. And I think a lot of times too, we might shy away from that, fearing that we would overimpose ourselves. But again, the child is very forgiving. So if we do, just go a little bit too much in the responsibility direction, we can always say to the child, I probably should have spoken to you in a different way, or I should have handled that situation in a different way. And they're wonderful about that. That's part of their natural characteristics as well. So I think if we can get over that fear of making a mistake, that's really helpful as well as adults. And that helps us to become freer ourselves in working with the children.
Well, but also, if you allow yourself to make a mistake in front of the
Yeah.
child, it gives them freedom to make mistakes, to feel
Exactly.
comfortable making mistakes as well. But I mean, how many of us are very afraid of making mistakes? So it's that modeling that we talk so much about in the toddler atrium. If you model making a mistake and responding to it,
Right.
they absorb that as well. And I'm a huge believer in adults apologizing to children. So again, you're modeling humility. You are modeling
Yeah.
asking for forgiveness. Like that in itself is a huge lesson to the child. Like, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have corrected you here.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have stopped you from doing this, or whatever
Exactly.
your over responsibility side has
Yes.
done.
I know I had a situation like that just recently where there was a lot of noise coming from one area of the room, and so I went over. I was gonna put a stop to this. When I got there, they were hiding. They were hiding something. I was like, "No, what are you all up to? And what are you hiding?" And they kind of looked at me, and I said, I need to see what it is." Well, when they moved their arms, it was a poster that they were making for me. And they kind of looked at me, and I was like, "You know what? I feel really ashamed right now. I should not have corrected you like that." And they were like, "Yeah, you really shouldn't have." So, just to be able to be human with them, and to
Yes.
say, "Okay, you're working on freedom and responsibility. I'm working on that too." And so, so I loved that little situation. It was a great lesson for me in that balance.
Yes. Yeah, I find myself in the atrium. And honestly, I try and do this with my children as well. It's very hard with your own children, especially when you've got children. I've got kids in literally all 4 planes of development. But I try to pause before intervening.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And it's so much easier for me to do this in the atrium. I can stop for 10 seconds and ask the Holy Spirit to, guide me if I need to actually intervene with this child. It is much harder at home to do that with my children. One, because, we're moving so fast, but also I think that there's a greater sense of your pride being hit with your own children.
Sure.
So you respond faster. And so I am constantly post thinking, I didn't need to say that.
Right.
I didn't need to do that. Like it's constantly afterwards saying, that was an unnecessary intervention. That was an unnecessary thing I needed to say. They already had this covered. In the toddler, we talk about how the very young child has a delayed response of up to 30 seconds. So you tell them, pick up your toy, and it could take them 30 seconds to respond because they just have to process it. And that actually, just the knowledge of that, even with the youngest child, has taught me that I need to, when I say something, I wait for a little while. I don't need to, they're not listening.
Right.
I just have to, I don't need to keep repeating myself.
Yes.
That has actually helped me even with my older children to apply that, to just, give us a little bit. I don't need to keep saying it over and over and over again.
Right. And I think there's a wonderful resource that I always recommend to my participants in the course. And it's a book. It's called Positive Discipline in the Montessori Classroom. It's by Jane Nelson and Chip DiLorenzo. And I always recommend that they purchase this book. They have really hit the balance between freedom and responsibility. And they give so many practical tips. For example, what you were just saying about waiting. If a child knows, even if they're struggling, even if their will is struggling to choose to obey, just giving them that time and not continually repeating your request actually helps them to stop themselves and to readjust. So
yeah, I agree. And I think it gives them respect. So what I have found that helps me is if like an example for the atrium, and be like, can you put your rug away? Then I walk away. I don't watch and wait for them to put the rug away. I might circle back around and see that they put their rug away. But I don't sit there and wait. And in doing that, I'm giving them respect. But I think that they also get to hold on to this dignity of, I'm choosing to put my rug away rather than me hovering over the child. They feel forced to put their rug away.
Yes.
So there's a lot more dignity, I think, in that.
Yes. And just two things on that, Carrie. One, I think is important to remember with a very small child is that freedom is also dependent upon knowledge. So I've also had a situation where I remember a particular situation where I had asked a child to put their work back on the shelf, and they just sat there. They were 3. They just kind of ignored me. And I had, in that moment, I had the grace to say, maybe they don't know what I mean by a shelf. So I asked, I said, do you know what a shelf is? No. I was like, oh my goodness, of course you can't put your work back on the shelf if you don't know what a shelf is, right? So sometimes we also have to, especially with a very small child, make sure that they understand what they're being asked to do. And this is where it is always important for us to first show how to do something before expecting the child to do it.
Yeah, I think that's huge. I think we have expectations, again, both in the atrium and in our homes, of a child knowing how to do something or knowing how to do something right.
Yes.
And then when they don't, we are upset or disappointed or whatever. But really, we need to take Montessori's idea of isolating the difficulty and teaching them step by step how to wash your hands or how to wash the dishes or how to put your work back on the shelf or whatever. We cannot assume that they know how to do this thing or do it the way we're wanting them to or whatever. Right now I'm thinking about my home, but I think we respond sometimes to their lack of doing it or knowing how to do it, but really it's our fault. We have not taught them.
Exactly.
We have not taught them how to do something.
That poor 3-year-old had no idea what a shelf was.
I imagine their eyes were really big.
Yeah. So it's like, oh my goodness, silly me. And the other thing is, I really like what you said about walking away and not standing there so that the child has the opportunity to feel that they make that choice freely. I think that's really important, especially because they are human just like we are human. And if we think about how we like to be treated, we don't like it if somebody stands over us and says, do this now. We tend to, it's our natural instinct of, I'm a free human person, to say, I don't want to do what you want me to do, So,
right.
But to give that time for that person for their intellect to say, okay, why does she want me to do this? Okay, yes, because if I don't put my rug away, there's less space for other people to work. Yes, it's really true that I should put my rug away. Okay, I'm going to put my rug away. And then for the will to make that choice freely and for that to be their choice, I think is really important.
One other thought I have about freedom and discipline, freedom and responsibility, is the difference between each child. We set up an atrium environment, both the physical and just the ways of the atrium. And we have this limit of this balance of freedom and responsibility that we're trying to create in there. But each child, we might have to alter that just a tad, and we'll talk more the practicals of that in the next 2 episodes. But I just think it's important to lift up that some children need a little bit more of the responsibility side. And some children are able to handle more of the freedom side, or throughout the atrium year, that's going to look differently. So knowing though that, and that idea that it's not the child's fault when things, first checking ourselves, that we might have to adjust ourselves for each individual child a little bit. They're coming to us, especially if we're only having them for 2 hours a week.
Yes.
Unlike you in a Montessori classroom, it's different. So they're coming from many, many hours without freedom and discipline, freedom and responsibility mostly. So keeping that in mind, that we need to look at the face of the child that's in front of us each week, observing them and adjusting ourselves and the environment based off of that.
Right. Yes, that's very important. Yes, that requires observation, which
Yes.
is another important Montessori principle there. So,
Yeah. Sit on your hands and observe.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, sister, is there anything else that you would like to lift up about this huge topic before we finish up today?
Oh, let me see. Oh, there was one thing. You gave the example of students who have not been given responsibility. It's actually something that we intuitively know. For example, even in conventional education settings, teachers are recommended, if they have a child who's disorderly, to give that child something to do, give them a responsibility in the class. And that usually works. And the reason that it works is because that child has been given an understanding of something that is true and good. And then they've been given the opportunity to be responsible for that. So always, the intellect being able to identify what is true and what is good, and then the will having the ability to choose that. Yeah.
It's all so beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And I love Shauna's chapter,
Mm-hmm.
Freedom, Independence, and Discipline.
Yes.
Chapter 12 of Nurturing the Whole Child. It's a great companion to this conversation.
Absolutely.
I'd also point to Montessori's book, The Discovery of the Child. I think that one also is a great resource.
Yes.
For this conversation as well.
Well, I'm very grateful for Gianna, however, because as I pointed out in the beginning, if you dive right into Montessori, sometimes she can be very, she can use a lot of hyperbole and get very emphatic. Whereas Gianna's kind of taken Montessori and she has distilled it for us in a way that I think is really helpful. And if I might just point out one more thing that she says that I think is important, is on page 82. She says, to be independent means to be free and not to be dependent on others, because I find that I am capable of doing what I need to do. So, too, does a person become secure in himself or herself, a strong I who will know how to choose the good and reject the evil, a person who will know how to be oneself. That also brings up just that wonderful continuum of dependence, interdependencies, and independence. And anyway, we could talk about this for hours.
I mean, what you just read alone, because it goes into, like, I'm thinking about teenagers and their understanding who they are as a person, and how this freedom and responsibility from a very young age even can help aid in who am I, being able to answer that question and being able to choose good from evil. So she's saying that this freedom and responsibility is important for moral development.
Exactly.
So even from a very young age with our toddlers, by applying freedom and responsibility, we are building the foundation for being able to choose right and wrong.
Yes.
Like it's huge. The topic is very onion-like, right? It's just very, or maybe ripple effects is a better analogy for it.
Exactly. I mean, really, Carrie, this is huge. You could have an entire course on this. So hopefully we've given you a few.
So how about you do that?
Hopefully we've given a few markers of the more important highlights, but it is huge.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Sister Maria Teresita. I really appreciate you joining me today.
Oh, thank you, Carrie. It's been lovely.
Thank you all for listening to this week's episode of the Good Shepherd and the Child podcast. So in our show notes, I have for you some links on Jana's book, Nurturing the Whole Child, which I will point you to chapter 12. And the chapter Freedom, Independence, and Discipline really goes along beautifully with this series that we will be doing. So I point you to that. I'm also going to go ahead and put in our show notes links to the books that Sister Maria Teresita pointed out. Positive Discipline in the Montessori Classroom. We talked about Discovery of the Child by Montessori. Those links will also be in our show notes. There's also a link for you to listen to the past episode we have with Claire Paglia on freedom and discipline. This podcast is sponsored by the United States Association of the Catechists of the Good Shepherd. We would like to thank all of our contributing members because you are making this podcast possible. If you would like to know more about the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, or if you would like to become a member, please go to cgsusa.org. Thank you all for listening. We will see you in 2 weeks. Go and fall more deeply in love with God.